Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Professor Andrew Jones. I'm the chair of the Center for Chinese Studies, and it's a real pleasure to welcome everyone to the faculty club and to the second annual Elvera Kwang Siam Lim Memorial Lecture in Chinese Studies. This is an endowed lecture series that was made possible through a generous gift to the Center for Chinese Studies by Mrs. Lim's family to honor her dedication to scholarly exchange. With this endowment, we'll bring one eminent scholar to Berkeley each fall semester to present a public lecture, meet with faculty and graduate students, and generally foster scholarly exchange and debate amongst colleagues. The namesake of this new series, Elvera Kwang Siam Lim, was born in Shantou, Guangdong province in 1928. She was sent to Hong Kong to attend high school and later received her undergraduate degree from the University of Hong Kong. After receiving her PhD from the University of Hawaii, Mrs. Lim took a position in the biology department of the newly established Chinese University of Hong Kong, where she remained until her retirement in 1989. She passed away in Oakland, California on March 27th, 2006, and again, the lecture is in honor of her life and her career. So with that, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, the eminent scholar that we mentioned earlier, who is Professor Zhang of the University of California, Davis. Professor Zhang is presently the chair of the socio-cultural wing of the Department of Anthropology at UC Davis. She's been an associate professor of anthropology at UC Davis for quite a long time, since the year 2003, and before that, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Fairbanks Center for East Asian Research. Even before that, of course, she received her PhD from Cornell University. And as I noticed going through her very voluminous CV, she also had a secret earlier life as a literary critic and literary theorist, which was quite intriguing and maybe informs some of the attention to textual detail and attention to the way in which narratives are crafted in her work, which is, I think, very central to her project that we see throughout her expanding corpus of scholarly work. There are a number of honors, actually too many to rehearse, that she has received, including a Guggenheim Fellowship for 2008 and 2009, I assume to continue her present work, as well as a Chancellor's Fellowship from the University of California in 2004 and 2005, and that's only a sampling. But I think probably one of the most illustrious honors here is the Robert E. Park Book Award for her first book, Strangers in the City, Reconfigurations of Space, Power, and Social Networks Within China's Floating Population. This was published by Stanford in 2001. I think it's a groundbreaking study of the floating population in China, and it really, I think, straddles a number of different disciplinary approaches and methodologies, from urban sociology to anthropology to urban studies, and it's been widely recognized in the field, and it's a really just very fine and quite influential work. Since that groundbreaking book, Strangers in the City, Professor Zhang has also co-edited with Ai Wang a book which is it out? No,
yes,
actually, it's just come out in 2008 from Cornell University Press, entitled Privatizing China, Socialism from Afar. There's also another forthcoming book entitled In Search of Paradise, Middle-Class Living, and Activism in a Chinese Metropolis. The metropolis being? Kunming, yes, that's what
yes.
I thought. Yeah. And in addition to that, there are a number of articles. I'll just give you a sense of the kind of scope of Professor Zhang's work. I'll recite some of the more recent articles. We can't go through them all because I would eclipse her presentation and we'd be here all day. So forthcoming, there's a article entitled Post-Socialist Urban Dystopia, A View from the Margins, which will be in a collected volume called Urban Dystopias. There's another recent article, 2008, entitled Privatizing China, Powers of the Self, Socialism from Afar, which I assume is linked to the
together.
volume, the co-edited volume. From the mountains and the fields, urban transition in the anthropology of China, contesting spatial modernity in late socialist China. These are just some of the, and then a paper which I think must reflect that secret past in literary theory, Shen Yun, exploring a key Chinese aesthetic category.
Yes.
And finally, Force from Home, property rights, civic activism, and the politics of relocation in China. So this gives you a sense of the scope and breadth of the work. So I will just clam up at this point and turn the floor over to Professor Zhang. Welcome to Berkeley, and thank you for delivering this year's Elvera, Kwang, Siam, Lim Memorial Lecture.
Thank you, Andrew, for the generous introduction. And also I'd like to thank the faculty at the Center for Chinese Studies for inviting me. It's truly an honor to be part of this lecture series. I also appreciate this opportunity to share my work with you all here. I really look forward to the discussion. Hopefully we'll have a lot of time for discussion. My presentation today is part of a larger book project that I have been working on over the past 7 years. This project, it's now a book manuscript under contract with Cornell, tentatively titled In Search of Paradise, Middle Class Living and Activism in a Chinese Metropolis. So I just want to give you a little bit of sense of what this project is about. This book is essentially an ethnographic account of the profound social, spatial, and cultural effects of privatizing home ownership in Kunming, a thriving metropolis in Southwest China. It's also my hometown. From 2000 to 2006, I conducted ethnographic fieldwork there for a total of 15 months. So my primary concern in this project is to understand how the rise of private ownership is reconfiguring urban space, regimes of living, middle-class culture, and the sense of the self in contemporary China. My talk today draws from one chapter of that book, and I hope just this brief introduction here would give you a sense of how my talk today fits into this larger picture. So scholars have shown that in Chinese society, both pre-1949 and socialist periods, the self or personhood is deeply embedded in the larger social relationships, including family, kin, neighbors, and danwei. What it means to be a socially recognized person in a local moral world is largely defined in the interpersonal relationship and experiences and through social transactions such as gift exchange. So the production of selfhood and the persons is realized in a relational process of constantly producing and maintaining social ties and moral status, as well as cultivating culturally appropriate behaviors towards others. Self-worth is closely intertwined with, if not completely subjugated to, the interests and the needs of the collectives, from the family to the nation state, and also to the moral judgment of others. The form of individualism that tends to promote individualistic desires and interests is relatively weak in China. This socially embedded nature of the self, however, has been undergoing profound transformations over the past 2 decades. An NPR reporter has recently claimed that Chinese society is becoming a nation of individuals. Others have declared that the age of we is vanishing while the age of I is coming. I would not go so far to declare that the we has been erased into the I, as the social and the collective remain important despite the rise of individualism today. However, I think the I and we split is becoming more and more pronounced in the post-Deng Xiaoping era and is inseparable from the rise of mass consumerism. The privatization of housing and recent enacting of property right law, 物权法, reinforce this trend of individualization. So it is in this context that I argue that self-worth and the value of love and marriage have become more measurable and exchangeable through the lens of property possession. Today, I would like to talk about how self-worth, romantic love, and the conjugal relationship are revalorized because of the increased importance of private property ownership in urban Chinese life. My research indicates that owning a private house has gradually become the decisive factor in considering marriage and also a focal point of contention in dissolving that relationship. In most Chinese cities today, as you all know, patrilocal residential pattern is no longer the norm, and most young people prefer to set up their own household either before or right after they get married. So having a house of their own has become an important indicator of an independent lifestyle, a measure of their success, and also a concrete embodiment of the new middle class aspiration. If, as some researchers have shown, watches, bicycles, and sewing machines were popular choices of marriage-related consumptions in the 1970s, I still remember those things. And the color TVs and refrigerators and the washers and the furniture in the 1980s. It is houses and the cars that have undoubtedly become the most desirable items since the 1990s. Today, people talk about that when they talk about marriage. Because of the significantly increased financial investment in private home ownership, so one can imagine the heightened intensity of property dispute in the event of divorce. I'm going to talk about that too. Now, let me just quickly show you a few slides of just to give you a sense of the kinds of middle-class communities I did my research. Okay, what they look like. So this is a guarded gate of an upscale community in Kwang, and the gate is very important. Landscaping upscale townhouse community. As you can see, I have slides later. The working class communities do not have this kind of a green, lush landscape. Jade Garden, another very expensive community in downtown Kunming. Another one. And this is a more even upscale villa. Chinese people call villa. It's just single detached home. They're not even detached, actually. They're connected, but those are villas. 别墅. And this is the interior decoration of a family I interviewed. I love this one. It's a French and the Chinese and the English is very small, and the Korean. But the sense of privacy and the private property, a security guard, someone here, Jenny, just said, that's where I lived. She stayed there in that compound, actually. It's a huge one. Advertisement for all this new development for townhouses in China. And then workers waiting to get in. These are the cleaning ladies and the guys for working for the middle class. So if you compare the kinds of lower income housing mostly developed in the 1980s and the 70s, it's very different from what you see the new housing today. Okay, and a lot of metal bars to prevent theft. Okay, I'm going to just hold for now. I have a couple of ones I'm going to comment on. While there's an overall increased emphasis on material ownership in the social and intimate realm, it is also important, I think, to call attention to the very gendered nature of this change. Self-worth, now as past, is closely intertwined with the notions of masculinity and femininity. These are categories whose meanings are socially constructed and very fluid. As some scholars have shown in traditional China, normative manliness was formed around two sets of attributes. Wen, He Wu, which referred to the refined behavior and the scholarly achievement, and the physical strength and the martial prowess, respectively. Now, these qualities could be achieved through purposeful personal cultivation of one's mind and body. But into the Maoist era, as Nancy Chan, for example, noted, manliness shifted to a very different set of categories. Okay, highly politicized characteristics, for example, revolutionary fervor and selfless work. Now, in the new climate of a market economy and the consumer culture today, the meanings of masculinities have shifted towards one's ability to make money, possess desirable consumer goods, or gain political power. For women, the externalization of self-worth focuses more on the body and the physical appearance, which both serve as the material foundation for constructing femininities. The increased emphasis on the value of women's bodies and appearance is reflected in a growing trend of seeking cosmetic surgery among young and middle-aged urban women. If you have been to China, you will see there is a proliferation of clinics and centers specialized on breast reconstruction, eye lift, facelift, and so on in Chinese cities. I was offered by a lot of high school friends to go with them to do those things. They don't understand why I'm not too interested. Anyway, these places are catered to women who wish to improve their bodily image and make them more desirable and thus more valuable in the new market economy. Their bodies and the bodily images have become a form of valuable commodity that can be exchanged for material wealth and a comfortable life. The double emphasis of bodily investment among women and material quest among men is not surprising. As some researchers have suggested, the men's search for new masculine identities often requires new kinds of femininity, as the two often have been constructed in relation to one another. So what I will do in the remaining time here is to first briefly comment on public debates on the relationship between housing, self, and marriage in local newspapers and on the internet. And then I'm going to move to the ethnographic account to show how the trends I have just outlined here are played out in everyday life among Kunming residents through several ethnographic case studies. Now, my focus here is on how the shifting notions of self-worth and social valuation reconfigure the intimate realm of love and marriage in different situations. So I have actually 4 situations I'm going to talk about. Okay, so the first part is I have a subtitle called Off the Material Index. Now, if you go to the most popular Chinese search engine, Baidu, a lot of you know that, right? I'm just typing a few words, 房子, 婚姻, 自我, 价值, and I hit go. Okay, you will see a lot of web links that contain articles and postings. After reading numerous of these postings, it became clear to me that home ownership or material possession in general is becoming an increasingly important index of one's worth and happiness in urban China today. Now, let me begin with an article titled 现代人的较量, The Modern Men's Contest, which critiques this troubling trend of materialization in post-Mao China. The author begins by lamenting the loss of 本真, so inner spiritual qualities, in the age of materialism in China. Quote, in this modern era, human beings are materialized, 物质化, to a large degree. A person's worth and status can be simply equated with the possession of houses, expensive cars, and other assets, unquote. The author continues and marks this fierce, he called it fierce material competition. Quote, modern people like to greet others in China today, he's referring to China, with such questions. Have you bought a house yet? 买房子吗? Have you upgraded your home? 有没有装修? So houses and cars have become their favorite assets because these two things in their eyes best represent one's material well-being and best exemplify their worth and social status, unquote. This article is a powerful commentary on an ironic situation of emerging consumer alienation. People become possessed by their own material possessions today and are lost in a blind contest over material possession. Now, in another article titled House and Marriage, 住房和婚姻, a lot of these kind of articles actually. A school teacher who cannot afford to buy a house comment on a major obstacle to marriage facing him and other men. So this is a longer quote. He said, in ancient times, marriage followed two basic principles, matching the status of the two families involved, and matching a man of talent with women of pleasant appearance. So 门当户对和郎才女貌, right? But today, a man's 才 talent has muted into another kind of 才 material wealth, because there's a linguistic playing here. If a man does not have talent or good looks today, it's not a big problem. But if he does not have wealth, that will not work. And one of the most important reflections of his 才 is home ownership. So I think this is interesting here. This 才 talent becoming material wealth 才. The shift from the first 才to the second 才in marriage consideration indicates a deeper and a larger shift in societal valuation that now underscores the importance of material wealth. This teacher further notes that for ordinary people like him, with very modest income, buying commodity housing, 商品房, is as difficult as climbing up the sky. That's his word. This teacher's concern reflects what I found during my conversations with many Kunming residents. Home ownership has undeniably become one of the primary concerns in their decision-making, and how they actually value the worth of their potential spouse. And this is particularly true for men who are still largely held responsible for providing a place to live. There are many more examples here, but I will skip. So let me just quickly mention one special column in a popular newspaper in Kunming that features a series of reports on the centrality of housing in marriage. The title of this series of reports is called, there are numerous titles in this series. You can tell from the titles, they are very revealing. A house is a man's dignity. There's one article. 房子是男人的尊严. Second, how can one talk about marriage without owning a house? 没有房子怎么敢谈婚姻? There is also a cartoon in this column which vividly shows that home ownership has become a necessary condition for talking about love. Okay, so this is the one. I want to show you. It's unfortunately, let's see. Yeah. Somehow my digital picture didn't turn out to be well. So, but anyway, so that's the cartoon you can see. So a man and a woman holding hands, facing each other as if they're exchanging vows or something like that. And their heads and the upper bodies yet are all framed by a house with a smoking chimney. So that's to show that, what they're thinking. That's very important, is house. This shift to a hyper-property-centered perspective represents a new trend in the conception of self-worth and valuation of marriage. So now I'm going to turn to the ethnographic case studies to show 4 different situations. Situation 1, evidence of love with the question mark. Miss Su was in her late 40s when I first met her in 2004. She had been separated from her husband for several years. She and her estranged husband each had their own independent life, but remained living in the same apartment they purchased together from her work unit. So it was a very awkward situation. I asked Miss Su why they did not get divorced. She said that it would be too complicated since they had to deal with division of the property, child custody, and some other issues. So she had dated several other men, but none of the relationships lasted. Sue was attractive but insecure. She believed that the most important capital a woman could possess was her looks and the physical body. Therefore, she underwent several cosmetic surgeries and also had frequent Botox treatments. She was also on a very special diet treatment and exercised vigorously to stay slim. And she hoped that such efforts would keep her appearance younger and prettier, so thus more valuable on the dating and marriage market. So in 2005, she met a Chinese-American man, Mr. Zhang, who returned to Kunming to look for his roots. He was born into a very wealthy family prior to the revolution, and then the family left for America. He had been divorced 3 times and was considered well-to-do because of his successful business. So soon after they met in Kunming, they began to date, even though he was 12 years older than her. It was a big deal in China, the age difference. Su was very proud of his family background and was content with his financial well-being. He bought a new car for her and hired a domestic worker for her. A year later, she divorced the husband, who was very self-proud, according to her, and then left without anything, without asking for the house. It's very unusual, actually. As her affair developed, one thing bothered her greatly. Mr. Zhao somehow would not propose to her, but was content with their relationship as lovers. She was disturbed at first because she interpreted this as a sign of lacking commitment on his part. He explained to her that real love does not need marriage license. And he was afraid because of his past divorce experiences. But Su was not convinced that because she needed a proof of his love. So, quote here, how can I know for sure that he loves me? And how can I explain to my friends if there's nothing tangible there to prove his love? People here would think that I'm just another fool. You know, in Chinese culture, marriage still is very important, unquote. Then one day, Mr. Zhao surprised her. Not with a marriage proposal. He bought a piece of farmland just outside Kunming and planned to have a Western-style villa, 别墅, built for them. He wanted to present this villa to her as the evidence of his love and commitment. So Miss Su was deeply touched, and then they began to work on this whole project about building the villa and the decoration. She gradually believed that his love was as real as the villa. They began to spend a lot of time, weekends there together. She was very proud of the villa, so she offered me to take a tour there. I, of course, anthropologist, right? We take all those opportunities. I gladly accepted invitation. On the way, I asked her very carefully, well, how about the marriage? Does it still bother you? And she said, well, you know, I do not think it's going to happen soon, but it's okay for now. I think he's very serious about me. Maybe he's just too scared to propose marriage. And then I said, does the house really make a difference here to you? I asked very boldly. I mean, it's very bold. So she said, yes, of course. I now feel that we have a real home together. I know that he loves me and wants to spend his life with me. Only a fool, she said, will throw away such a large amount of money. Don't you think so? Then she paused and said, well, even if someday we end up separating, I would still have gained a lot. How many Chinese men here can buy me the villa of my dream? She actually used the 昆明话, said 很划得来,还是划得来, 她说, to describe as if it's a very lucrative business transaction. I was very shocked, actually. So we finally arrived at a large courtyard hidden on a farm. Inside it stood a spacious 2-story villa with a brownish kind of stone face and a large chimney, large balcony, white grade window, French doors. Those are the signs taken as very modern and Western. So the interior of the house was also tastefully decorated with nice tiles and wood floor, as a nice fireplace. And above the fireplace, there was a huge oil painting of Miss Su there. Yeah, I think this painting and this prime location was very important because it indicated her status in this house as the master of this house. Su said, actually now I just call him 老公 in front of people, and no one would ask whether we really got married. They know we have a place together and they see us together, so that's important. The term 老公 is very vague. It could be your husband, but it could be your partner, whatever. So it's a very vague term. It became clear to me that the villa stood for the evidence of his love and the validation of their relationship. In the age of private property, the financial weight of this house had overridden the significance of a marriage license. It also served as a form of potential compensation or insurance of her time and emotion invested in case they break up eventually. And finally, this was the realization of her dream of attaining a high-class lifestyle. So this does not mean that romantic love is not important to Miss Su. However, what's revealing here is that for her, emotionality and materiality have become mutually constitutive, and the house can actually serve as the evidence of love. I mean, she actually said that, 证明他爱我, evidence. Situation 2, okay, the price of divorce and freedom. If owning a house has become a crucial factor for entering a marital relationship, it also has become a decisive factor in settling divorces. Many couples in China fight fiercely over property division today. For most couples I interviewed, divorced couples, extramarital affairs were a most frequently cited cause. The one who felt most hurt emotionally tend to seek revenge by holding on the dying marriage, or believe that she or he had more leverage in demanding a better deal of settlement. The other person who wished to exit the relationship for whatever reason, usually for the newfound love, was more likely to give in during this negotiation, and the house was taken as the ultimate price one must pay for the emotional damage. So Mr. Liu Dong was considered a very popular doctor at a major hospital in Kunming. When I first met him, he was in his late 30s and seemed to have a wonderful family. His wife was an attractive woman, a professor at the local university, and had a lovely daughter. But soon, rumors spread that Liu Dong had an affair with a divorced professional woman. 3 years later, the affair became rather public. He began to bring his lover to friends' gatherings and other occasions. So his wife was heartbroken and refused to talk about divorce at first. Liu was determined to pursue the relationship, but facing his adamant attitude, his wife had gradually grown very cold and practical, so they fought frequently and eventually began to negotiate over a divorce. Her condition was very simple and firm. She would have the full ownership of the 3-bedroom apartments they purchased together from his work unit. And she also demanded the custody of their only son and his full financial support. Although the size and the quality of this apartment could not match those new, housing I just showed you, it was well located and actually was worth more than 200,000 yuan. So this demand was not a small deal because it involved the largest asset they had at that time. Liu hesitated and hoped to negotiate for a better deal, but his wife would not give in, and she was very firm. She was hoping that demand on home ownership might make him rethink and eventually change his mind. In this sense, this demand could be seen almost as a ransom, a price to pay for his new relationship, or a compensation for the best years she claimed she spent with this guy. But Liu was anxious about getting out of this relationship to marry the woman, the other woman. So after a year of exhausting struggle, they finally agreed with her condition, actually. All she demanded. So after the divorce, Liu worked very hard in order to earn enough money to put on a down payment for a new apartment. So later, I think last time when I went back, he finally bought a new home in a private commodity housing compound, even though he had to commute to work and work really hard to pay for this, but he was very happy. He said, I need a private space and privacy, even if it means I have to work really hard because I'm just tired of running my 同事 and ex-wife in the old compound. So he wants to start a new life there. Now, in another divorce case I discuss in the book, it's a woman actually who was very anxious to exit the relationship, and eventually her husband used the tactic of delay to eventually gain control over the house they purchased and also withhold their joint savings. So she actually lost a lot to get out of that relationship. Okay, situation 3. The shadow of doubt. Property ownership affects decisions regarding not only dating, marriage, but also whether one should get married again. If a woman manages to secure a handsome settlement from her ex-husband who abandoned her for another woman, marrying another man whose economic status is likely to be significantly lower than hers is worth contemplating. There's always the shadow of doubt about his true motivation there. So is it love or is it greed? In case the second marriage falls apart, right, the division of property takes place, it would mean a big financial loss to this woman, to the woman. So given this consideration, several women in this situation I interviewed were very cautious about their next move. Some would rather keep on the ownership of the property than getting a new husband who might undermine their own wealth. Others would rather engage in more casual romantic relationships to protect their financial and personal freedom. So let me just give you a kind of a quick example here about a woman I named her Xie Yun. She's a single mother of a 6-year-old boy. I've actually known her since high school. She was my high school friend. When I reconnected with her in the summer of 2004, I found out that she was married to a very wealthy entrepreneur. They bought a luxury apartment in an upscale housing compound. Her son attended an expensive private nursery and had his own nanny. But over time, the existence of her husband became mystery to me because I had never seen him around. I've been to their houses many times. And I also noticed in her house, there was not a single picture of her husband. You know, she has a wedding picture. She dressed up in this wedding gown, but by herself. So I thought it was very strange. And she only said that, well, you know, my husband was very busy and she had business all over China in different cities, but he often calls. Now, one day in 2006, so 2 years later, as we were watching our kids, you know, playing on the playing ground, she suddenly let out a sign and said to me, you know, Li, men just can't get rich. As soon as they have money, they want to chase younger women. Chinese women are very pitiful because when their husbands cheat on them, they have to put up with it if they want to save the marriage. I cannot do that, so I let my husband go. So I was very shocked. She never told that to me. Actually, she said, I have been divorced for almost 3 years. He fell in love with another younger woman and was with her most of the time. He pushed me so hard for the divorce that I just could not stand the emotional torture. And then she talks about, you know, it's very sad. My son doesn't even know this and rarely sees his dad. Now, as part of the settlement, Xie Yun got the luxury apartment and a new car. And her ex-husband also agreed to pay for all her and her son's living expenses, plus all the tuitions and fees for the private school for the child. So as a result, she doesn't have to work. She's actually a housewife now. And she could live a very comfortable life. Now, recently, her ex-husband also upgraded her car to a brand new silver Audi and bought another even larger apartment for her in that compound. I don't know about this man, but the total cash value of the two apartments and the cars easily approached 3 million yuan, and not counting all these other fees they pay for this son. I mean, he does ice hockey, chess, private piano, anything you can think about. So I asked Ms. Xie whether she was dating or had considered marrying another man. She said no, because it was too difficult to find a good man with a successful career. She said, you know, if he is successful, the same story would repeat. If not, I have to deal with the property issue. It's just too complicated. Also, this new man will not feel comfortable coming to live in a house paid by my ex-husband. It will injure his self-esteem. I think once a man knows my situation, he will back down. And it happened before, she said. Unquote. She also felt suspicious about the motives of those men who were interested in her. She cannot be sure, and that just makes her anxious. So she has decided to remain single, at least for now, and just focus on raising their son. Her parents actually moved in to live with them, and the son is undoubtedly the center of the whole household. And for her, she said, love can wait, because dating without the prospect of marriage, it's just not her cup of tea. Unlike her, other women I talked to, divorced women, had developed a very different lifestyle, since some of them had already owned a house and also enjoyed a secure income. They preferred to remain single or just develop a romantic relationship that would not lead to marriage. However, there is an emotional cost to these women. They talk to me frequently also about the loneliness, insecurity, and the worries about their future years of aging without a spouse. So it's not a complete rosy picture there. Situation 4, this is the last situation, the inadequacy complex. Those who lack basic material ownership have been increasingly considered undesirable, devalued, or even seriously flawed by the larger society. This is particularly true for men who are regarded as the primary provider for the family in a market-driven society. So even if some men are able to get married, they tend to have a low status within the family and suffer from what I call the inadequacy complex, caused by their acute awareness of their inability to provide financially. So this feeling of lack is not confined to one's financial capability, but also affects the perception of manhood. Researchers have shown that masculinity is a highly unstable social construct fraught with anxiety over the perceived lack, so being material or sexual. Several men I interviewed said that they felt inferior, shame, and even guilty in front of their wife and family members, especially her family members. They were not well respected by their parents-in-law and had a weaker voice in the household. So I'll give you one example here. Fan Ming, I interviewed this guy a lot. Fan Ming is a man who's caught in this situation. He has actually a bachelor degree in Chinese medicine, but quit his poorly paid job as a factory employed doctor 10 years ago. He began to sell life and catastrophic insurance policies. So the business was going really well for a while, for the first several years, because he could utilize all his guanxi network. But then he ran out of the social connection. People, you need to cultivate potential clients. So his income dropped considerably to less than 500 yuan a month. To survive, he began to take on temporary low-paid jobs, but none of them lasted very long. The financial pressure began to cause stress in Fan Ming's marriage. His wife is a teacher at a professional school with a limited income. So when they got married in late 1990s, they hoped to buy a modest apartment from her school during privatization, right? It's much cheaper, 房改房. But now they can barely make ends meet, let alone buying a home. She has become more and more resentful about their financial situation and feels embarrassed in front of their friends and relatives in their household. She is the primary decision maker regarding what to buy and what to do. She often criticizes him for being lazy and incapable, and she's pushing him to go out to get a real job or to prepare for the qualifying exam to obtain a license in China today. If you want to practice medicine, Chinese or Western, you have to take this exam. So actually I have good news, after this is 2006. So this time I went back, he did pass, he got his license, but he still has no job right now, unfortunately. So Fan Ming talked about his unbearable situation as follows. Sometimes I do not even want to return home because I know I have to face her nagging. I do not want to fight either because I feel that I do not have the right to fight. I am a man and I cannot provide for the family. On what grounds do I defend myself? I know she's angry at me and she has a good reason because I have to depend on her for housing and food. She has not left me because I think she still hopes that I will find something better with my medical background. And also, he said this to me, she does not want to have a child, and I have not made a big deal out of it. Most men would divorce her, he said. So when men like Fan Ming believe that it is their primary responsibility to provide for the family, yet is unable to do so. They feel that their manhood and dignity are threatened. They find it hard to talk about selfhood when their manhood is stripped away. In Fan Ming's case, this sense of failure and humiliation is reinforced also by his wife's constant anxiety and negative remarks. Okay, so these are the 4 situations. Now, the increased salience and the gendered understanding of property ownership in marriage is also well reflected in the marriage advertisement, 征婚广告 in local newspapers. So here I just want to show you really quickly and talk about the trend there. In the majority of the advertisement I have studied, private home and car ownership are the most common and salient elements. The emphasis on material possession is particularly strong in men's ads, although I think both sides talk about 备车房, I have a car or house, but it's definitely very, very strong in the advertisement for men. The typical phrase is, like I said here, 备车房, meaning equipped with a car and a house. And some advertisements use specific frames, such as I own a 别墅 or 豪宅 mention 名车 to point out that the even higher status of their possession. But by contrast, for women, the information about their 车或者房 ownership status tend to be less emphasized, although it's still there. Instead, they also highlight their physical appearance and the body figure by using such phrases. White skin, people are obsessed with that. 皮肤很白, white skin, beautiful and fashionable, model-like bodies, elegant, and so on, this kind of thing. And some advertisement by women also use very straightforward phrases to show their actually wealth status. 女富商, wealthy female merchants, or I like this one, 美少妇. It's not 妇女的妇, it's not women, it's 美少妇, the rich, the wealth 妇. So they play a lot of those linguistic games there to indicate their financial status. But it's definitely less a defining feature. Here, let me see. Yes, this is the last one. So as you can see, all this advertisement, but lots of advertisement in local newspapers is thick stack, and for men, definitely, if you don't have 车和房, your likelihood of finding someone is very low. I think for women, wealth is a plus, but must be accompanied by a desirable figure and a pleasant feminine looks. Otherwise, their material possession may not be so valuable, or can even become potentially threatening to men who just can't measure up. So I'll offer some concluding remarks here. In an increasingly hyper-materialistic environment, a new life orientation is emerging, and what it means to be a man and a woman is shifting. As anthropologist Liu Xin, here, who is sitting here, puts it in his new study, in your new book, life has become a management of material things comparable to and measurable in terms of other people's possessions. Unquote. What is at the center of this materialistic term is private property ownership centrally embodied in the possession of a house and a car. The obsession over material possession and consumer goods become a defining feature of the new middle class in urban China today. And again, the task of generating such wealth is unevenly placed on the shoulders of men. They must now contend even harder in the race for material gains in order to preserve and enhance their manhood. Masculinity is increasingly being defined by one's entrepreneurial ability and the power to provide and consume. So this is the broad social condition that shapes marriage, social expectations, and the meaning of self-worth today. But I think what we witness today is only the beginning of a shift from a socially and morally based notion of the self to a materially based one. Also a shift from qualitative differentiation to a quantitative differentiation that can be measured by your material possession. Mei-Fei Yang has once observed that, quote, Chinese personhood and personal identity are not given in abstract terms as something intrinsic to and fixed in human nature, but are constantly being created, altered, and dismantled in particular social relationships, unquote. Now, after nearly 3 decades of economic reform, this sense of social embeddedness that was once at the heart of a moral economy has been eclipsed by an individual-centered, materialistic, determinism in a market economy. I use the word eclipsed because I don't want to say replaced. The reason is that the socially embedded understandings of personhood and social worth continues to be very relevant. It's not completely gone. And Chinese people now must negotiate these 2 very different ways of thinking about selfhood and self-worth harder than ever. This hyper-materialistic way of thinking about love, marriage, and self-worth represents a very different mode of social valuation than that generated under high socialism. This time, tangible materiality and intangible feelings and emotionalities are simply brought on the same scale of valuation. And this kind of exchange is also openly articulated in private conversations, but also in public spheres. I, of course, do not suggest that such thinking and practice were absent in Chinese society before, because many scholars have shown that in pre-1949 China, property was at the very core of marriage transactions. And later, the socialist state did not completely eliminate this practice either. So financial transactions were still connected to the transfer of the rights of women in rural China, even in the reform period. In the cities, people were also very much concerned about the financial status of their potential spouse under socialism. Even though a new different language of love and revolution was very much promoted by the state to combat what's called the vulgar materialistic attitude during the Mao's years. But the material possession during that period was very limited, and other factors such as one's political background, your hukou status, your danwei affiliation, all that played crucial roles in people's marriage choices and conceptions of personhood. Now, one might say that the current trend that emphasizes private property ownership is a return to the pre-1949 social practice. What I would suggest, but I would like to suggest that the valuation of private property in the reform years has reached a new intensity in a twisted form here. Ruby Watson once observed that marriage in Chinese society is about the movement of things as well as persons. Today, what my ethnographic account shows is that it's a really interesting, I think, a double movement here. On the one hand, the language of romantic love and emotionality has deeply penetrated in the realm of marriage, especially among the younger generation of urban kids, that they watch Western movies and talk about romantic love. So that's there. But on the other hand, the conjugal relationship is increasingly actually linked to the concern of property and material comfort. Although most urbanites nowadays rarely use the term such as dowry, a new form of calculating one's worth and desirability in market terms is very much alive. This time, self-worth and marriageability become increasingly objectifiable through 2 exchangeable things: men's material wealth and women's bodily images. As women become active participants of that exchange, their own bodies have also increasingly commodified and objectified as a form of quasi-property. Now here I must say that a third element, which I don't have time to discuss here, is 素质, actually further complicates this whole thing about the marriage market. Okay, but maybe during the Q&A question period we can talk about it. This trend of hyper-materialization and externalization is fundamentally reshaping what it means to be a man or a woman, as well as what constitutes the core of the gendered selfhood in China's new culture of consumerism. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zhang, for a fascinating talk. We do have a discussant today who will comment on the paper and then, I suppose, moderate the question and answer session as well. Well, you don't have to, but that would be helpful. And our discussion is our own Professor Yo Tianxing. She is an associate professor in the Department of Geography here at UC Berkeley. I'm sure many of you, if not most of you, know her. Professor Xing is the author of one previous book in 1998, Making Capitalism in China, The Taiwan Connection, and has two forthcoming books appearing very soon. The first is a co-edited volume with Qingquan Li, I believe, of University of UCLA, excuse me, thank you, of UCLA. This is entitled Reclaiming Chinese Society, the Politics of Redistribution, Recognition, and Representation, and that will be coming out through Routledge. A second single-authored volume is also coming out through Oxford University Press, also very soon, in 2009, and this is entitled The Great Urban Transformation, Politics of Property in China. So I think you can see quite clearly the relevance of Professor Xing's work for the kinds of issues that Professor Zhang has been discussing in her paper. So thank you for serving as a discussion, and welcome.
There. It's a name tag? Yeah.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Zhang Li, for this great paper in which I have the privilege to read before everybody else here. So I will keep my discussion as brief as possible so we leave the maximum time for discussion of this very interesting, inspiring paper. I will start with this TV documentary series in China that I saw a few years ago, produced by the CCTV. And it was also accompanied by a book with the same title, that is 居住改变中国. Literally, it means housing changes China. I couldn't find a better translation of that very term, 居住. So it's mainly about housing. In this documentary series, the producers covered a wide range of issues, including socialist housing and how it is changed into commodity housing, property and citizenship rights, and Chenzhongcun village in the city, a phenomenon in the historical preservation movement of old hutong housing in Beijing, and the fever of new town development in different cities in China, city planning issues, and even the importance of local newspapers in housing and place marketing. This is a very interesting collection of issues in this documentary. I was very impressed by the breadth of the production. And I actually also agree very much with the title of the series, that is Housing Changes China, 居住改变中国. If I can also play some linguistic game here, you have to know how this phrase is coined. It's not about 改变中国的房子. It's not about how certain type of housing is changing China. It's actually the fact that housing and related resettlement issues itself are changing China. It's much broader, a much bolder statement about this, about housing, about settlements, about human dwelling, that has a whole series of issues related to housing, and these are the issues that's one of the most fundamental changes in China today. Now, what makes the issue of housing and settlements one of the most fundamental questions in our inquiry about China's transformation then? How does it differ from enterprise restructuring, technology upgrading, foreign investment, redistribution programs and movements, and even the reform of bureaucracy and law and pop culture, and those that are also considered as very fundamental in our understanding of China's changes then? I started to look for possible answers to this question. Why and how housing is important, and how is it different from other aspects. With my own work on the politics of land development in Chinese cities and countryside, and try to see how land development has changed the power structure of the state and between the state and society, Now I'm only too happy to see that Zhang Li not only share this interest in built environment with me in terms of understanding China's changes, but also picks up a very important fundamental questions that I have been neglected all along. That is how housing ownership is related to this very fundamental question of class making and class marking, especially the new middle class in post-socialist China. In her particular paper that she's in this particular paper that she's presenting today, Zhang Li focused on the relationship between housing ownership and the practice of getting in and out of marriage, and the romance for urban middle class couples, and the intertwined calculation of the emotions and the materiality around housing. The stories she tells are giving this rather abstract term, 居住改变中国, housing changes China, a more concrete and much more powerful elaboration. I think this is a good example of ethnography at its best. Now, my curiosity, of course, when you have a good paper, you start to think a lot of crazy things, that kind of things, triggered by a good, inspiring paper, as always, and you start asking more questions. So, for example, one of the two things that I started wondering about is that in the stories that I read and I heard again today, I was very struck by the way housing has become the most important item that proves manhood, one of the most important items at least, in a demonstration of a man's ability to provide on a foundation of his feeling adequate. And also, I was very intrigued by the way housing ownership is viewed by women as either a demonstration of their partner's devotion and a material return of their emotional investment. And also, women's self-worth is largely built on their physical appearance. This description sounds like what one would imagine as a traditional, if not feudalistic, gender relations in the age of market economy. So this new yet old expression of femininity and masculinity reminds me of Mayfair Young's earlier work. We all mention Mayfair Young today, just a coincidence. But it's a different set of her earlier work. And her observation of changing gender relationship in China in one of her her documentaries as well. Yeah. Mayfair argued that the much celebrated gender equality under Mao's state feminism was in fact a promotion of gender sameness, in which women are expected to be just like men, do what men can do, and catching up with men by taking up these very heavy physical labor in farms and in factories, while feeling shamed of their feministic physical features. And then she further argued that this discourse of erasing gender differences in the name of gender equality has led to a void in the public consciousness of the complexity of gender issues to begin with, and also the failure in recognizing and discussing gender differences in public forum under Mao's period. And the market reform, therefore, aided by global consumer culture, had quickly swept up China and pushed Chinese women immediately back to the pre-revolution era, in which women's femininity is about being pretty and docile, reinforced by hyper-commodification of women's body. So she used the example of the popularity of young women in this man-oriented entertainment and service industry, and she used the example of how in karaoke bar, hostess has to kneel down to serve the drinks. So, and these young, beautiful women in new restaurants wearing these cheapao with very high slip, and PR girls and so on. So she used these examples to demonstrate that actually because of this gender erasure, in the new market economy, actually you have this rush back to the pre-evolution time in terms of gender relationship. So of course there is room for further development in Mayfair Young's argument in those, along those lines. But I also think that we might be able to benefit from this argument and then pursue the question of whether and how the seemingly very traditional, if not feudalistic gender relationship that we find in the middle class circle in Kunming today might be resulted from the discourse of gender erasure, or we might want to reverse the question if we believe in the fact that socialism did leave a mark in Chinese women. Then where can we find the traces of socialist legacy in which women are holding up half of the sky in the case of housing and property ownership in the new era? So I'd like to see, if you agree or disagree, there's always room for that kind of elaboration, I think. Okay, so that would be my first response, and I'd like to hear more from you. And then, of course, secondly, as a geographer, then it's just impossible for me not to ask questions about space, place, okay? And if we, we don't say you are what you eat, we say you are where you live. And then, ethnographers will examine the you and the live part. And geographers will say, then where is the word, here. Okay, so in that case, if we expand the question of housing into the question of location, of course, developers will share the same interest with me, of course. We might find other dimensions in the relationship between housing and class making and class marking, in addition to the stories about romance, marriage, and divorce. For example, in the housing location, questions may include schooling for children. Therefore, your 素质 issues will also come in, maybe. Educating your next generation in a good location where there's good school next to a good school, and social status affirmed by a particular street address or names of a prestigious 小区, or the selection of your neighborhoods and your neighbors, etc. And so this discussion of the geographical context of housing, namely location, is important also because the relativity of class and location. For example, the discussion of the relationship between housing and making the marking of new middle class may be enriched by a discussion of the relationship between the new middle class and the new lower class, reflected in and shaped by segregation between new middle class 小区 and new lower class neighborhoods, like what you show us in your slides. I know Zhang Li has done work in those areas as well. Actually, I've read one of her papers, particularly discussing that. So I would like to ask her to tell more stories along those lines to this audience as well, because I think that's also one of very important and interesting aspects of your book project. Okay, so I will stop here, and shall I serve as a coordinator? Okay, sure.
You. I think maybe I'll start by just briefly, responding to some of the questions, because after a while, you tend to forget, and then we'll take some more questions and revisit some of the questions. So thank you so much for the very, very insightful comments, very interesting. Actually, I haven't seen that documentary. I've seen another long one called The 房子, a 10-episode document, very interesting. But about your question, I think I will start by, the one about the gender erasure. Yes, I mean, I think Mayfair Young and also I think Lisa Rolfe, Emily Honig, they all wrote about the gender erasure under Mao, So whether what we see today is an interesting question you pose here, is almost like a response, a reaction or overreaction to that. I would say, yes, this is definitely part of the larger trend there, about this, because when people were deprived of what they conceived as the proper gender differences, women being able to wear colorful clothes and all stuff, after so many years, I think now when the condition is ready, I think there is a really overreaction to that. So it is part of this, I think, a general trend that's happening in China. So it's not just about housing in the marriage, but in many areas, you talked about how, gender differences actually have been so accentuated to the extent that sometimes you feel it's so so overdone. Every time I go back, people commenting on my clothes, on my cosmetic stuff, they don't feel like I'm feminine enough because, I'm supposed to do all these things they're doing there. So I think, that's a good observation there. I'm not sure whether I would call the feudalistic return, but certainly you see some sort of a parallel with how marriage was conducted and considered definitely in pre-1949 China. But what really interests me today is, like I mentioned in the paper briefly, is this twisted form. Is like, on the one hand, you see this calculative, concerns in the paper. People talk about that in very crude terms. On the other hand, they also talk about romance. They're very much drawn into the emotional aspect, the free choice. And so I'm trying to make sense of these two very diverging, I think, ways of thinking about marriage and love. So, the second question is much larger. I think that's about sort of the factors we have to consider in terms of the making of the new middle class. And of course, there are many factors that are at play. And I think you brought up this location that is very important. So it is not just about owning a house, a property, but what kind and where. So that's very important part. I don't think that element is very much developed here, but then in the essay I wrote for the edited volume Aihua and I put together, that's definitely much more about location and how location nowadays is used as a concrete way of social exclusion and inclusion. So who can be part of this and cannot be part of that, and that's very much at play. So I think maybe I should open up, and maybe people should feel free to revisit some of the questions. Yeah.
Andrew, and then yeah. Sure.
Pose myself too much, but I guess in listening to your talk, since the ethnographies that you give are in fact really wonderful little narratives on their own. I was thinking about narrative genre as you were speaking, and two kind of genres leaped out at me. The first is romance, right? And the second is detective fiction. And so I'm going to construct a couple actually different questions about those. And this actually gets back to Yotan's comments as well. It seems to me that this, the romance genre, or what you see as being two divergent discourses, a certain kind of, ideology of romance, and then this very calculating discourse of value, maybe aren't so different after all. If you think about, for instance, the genre or the narrative genre of romance, Jane Austen, right? Let's talk about Jane Austen, right? Jane Austen books are actually all about this very calculating economy of who ends up getting the manor house, right? They're about marriage markets, and they're about this kind of delicate negotiation and eventual attribution of property, right? Or property rights. And then the second genre, which struck me in your little narratives, which is quite wonderful, is about some kind of detective novel. You have one where a husband is mysteriously missing, right? And another one in which a house serves as evidence of not a crime, but of love, right?
Yes,
yeah.
weakness.
Right. And that story actually also constellates in some way around this issue of property again, right? The missing husband is kind of displaced by the property itself, and then the other one, love is, property stands in for, or serves as evidence of love. So I wonder actually if, a couple questions for me come out of this. One is the story you're telling, or this narrative about property displacing romance, a new story, or in what ways is it new? I mean, is this the same old story about the rise of a bourgeoisie that we see in a Jane Austen novel, or is there something different that has to do with post-socialism in this narrative? And that's another variation on the question that Professor Zhang asked about post-socialism, and whether they're kind of interesting remainders left over from standards of value that existed, or gender roles that existed previously. And the second one actually has to do with this question of changing property rights regimes in this particular period, right? So, for instance, one of the stories had to do with the fact that there is marriage in name only, right? Marriage without the legal imprimatur of, officially sanctioned marriage. And I wonder how much in that story that the problem of evidence hinged on the problem of not being inserted into a legal framework, right? And what that might have to do with changing property rights law in terms of ownership of housing or not. So I know those are two big questions.
Those are big questions. I'll try my best to start with the latter one. It's interesting about the property rights law. It's a relatively new law. I mean, it just got passed. Is it 2007, that's right. So it's relatively new. But even with the passing of the law, if you look at the home ownership, the deed today, you talk to these couples. I don't know whether that's the situation elsewhere, but in Kunming, it's very interesting. Usually only one person's name is on that deed, not both, and oftentimes husband, right? So it's not like here commonly, of course, you put both of your names on it, otherwise what's going to happen. But when I ask couples, they're actually not worried about that part. They are more worried about the social sanction, the socially recognized, they are the joint property owners than the legalistic term. Because I ask these people, say, well, why your name, the wife's, your name's not on that? She said, well, he can run away, and there's the danwei. The danwei is still very powerful there, because whenever you sell their property, even if your name is not, the spouse name is not on that, you have to actually get the zhengming from her danwei in order to actually sell it. So there are a lot of social mechanisms there. So that's I think the legalistic kind of a very strict legalist sense of property ownership, we're used to it here. It's still not quite there yet. I think maybe gradually we're sinking in. So in terms of, the impact on marriage, so for what that woman, Ms. Su, talks about, I guess eventually what she sees that as not so important is that they both they both own that house. I guess that's not very important. It's how they are viewed socially by still society as a couple. So that's shifting there. And your question, going back to that, whether this is new. Actually, I've given this talk at various places, and that's almost the question people would ask. So what's new about this, and what's Chinese about this in comparison with other places? I have to say, I'm not claiming this as a new phenomena, because in many ways I think you do see a lot of both parallels with the pre-revolutionary China practice, and then you also see a lot of parallels, as you suggested. I think what people view in China nowadays as what's happening in this very materialistic capitalist world in the West. So in a sense, maybe we're not only moving back in the sense backwards, but also converging with what's happening elsewhere in this world. So I can't claim too much about the Chineseness, except I think there are some, with regard to property, there are some sort of unique elements here we have to consider. That is, for example, one is the one-child policy in China. That has a significant impact on how property would be inherited for the younger generation, and that's very distinct from other places. But yeah, thank you. I think so.
We have, and then.
You sort of, my question was similar to the first gentleman he asked about. So I'm talking about Miss Su, who lives in this house where the boyfriend built. It's not in her name, because they're not even married anyway. What happens if he gets tired of her and kicks her out? Has she thought about that, or is that done in China?
Actually, for that house, I was dying to ask her whose name would be put on the deed, and she I didn't ask straightforward, but I did ask, well, so eventually, did you guys get the paper yet on deed of the house, because it was being built and all stuff? And she said, oh, we're working on that. So at one point, I sort of did ask her, I said, well, yeah, so I didn't say whose name is going to be. I said, whose house is this going to be? And she said, well, she insists it's our house. So I didn't push that too far. I don't know whether she would insist. It's possible that if she's very smart in a sense, she would push for that to say, put my name on that. But clearly at that time, it was not, she didn't say it was under his name. So I don't know. I think she would be smart enough to push for that. Yes.
But legally, you could just kick her out?
If her name is not on that. Yes. But I think in China, again, I keep asking people, legally, of course, easy. And you ask all those women, why don't you put your name on? But there are so many. They keep talking about all those other social mechanisms that are at play. Yes.
Okay, so we have this lady, and then So.
Thanks for your interesting talk. I got the sense from the 4 case studies that there is this simultaneous desire for upward mobility among the middle class that's set in tension with anxiety about downward mobility. And I wonder to what extent you think that housing is an index to not only defining the middle class, but also authenticating desires and authenticating this economic status and what the middle class means.
Yes, that's a great question, actually, about this, housing as a means of upward mobility, but also reflecting the deep anxiety in the book. In a larger project, I talk about among the middle class, the possibility of falling from grace, falling. That's definitely there. So yeah, I think housing, it is for men, I think it's less a means of upwards mobility. Okay, for them, they have to earn this in order to find a marriage partner and all the stuff. And for women, it's very clear, I think, from the study that it is one of the probably most important ways, other than your job, moving upwards, is to find someone who has good ownership of a nice house. And so it is a very, very important part. But I guess your question is not only just that, but it's also a way of, the way you put it,
defining the middle class for themselves, or authenticating what middle class means for them.
Yeah, nowadays, yes, if you want to, it used to be in socialist China, you say, where do you live? And you tell them the address, and people don't quite, in some cities like Shanghai, they can figure out. But like in Kunming, it's hard to figure out your status. But nowadays, it's so easy in terms of location. Taxi drivers, they're very snobbish too. So you tell them where you live, and if on the address, they know, they can pretty much position you where you are, where you belong to. So it is a very important ways of showing, maintaining, asserting your status. Yeah, thank you.
I want
to go back to the question about whether this is new or old. Because clearly, Chinese peasant society, the Republican bourgeois period, they just have lots of stories that echo and have many similar elements of profound calculation around property. And also, for instance, in pre-modern China, if a man didn't have land, didn't have access to land, he was totally useless, not a social being, practically. So the question is really what is different, and it seems to me that you're trying to say that the sense of self-worth is what's different. So it's not merely, having a property being an aspect of your identity, but rather the whole question of how do you negotiate access to that property. And in the earlier years, a woman, whether you're a peasant, or an urban housewife, you were profoundly dependent on your husband. So property had this profound, association with dependency. The kinship relationship, therefore, of the wife as kind of subordinate to the husband, or to be protected by the husband. Whereas something about your stories give me a sense, although I may be wrong, that these are pretty capable women who could actually make a living on their own. And so the difference, it seems to me, just from your stories, is this profound sense of self-calculation and self-maneuver, which perhaps in the past were done for or managed by the larger kinship group. And more you have, pretty educated professional women who are negotiating and calculating, by themselves to gain this property, which is not necessarily perhaps for their survival,
Right.
as in the past, their social and material survival, but in fact a means to expand their own individual worth.
Yeah. That's
And just the subsidiary thing is the mistress regime. I mean, there's a legal regime of property ownership, and there's the old mistress regime of property ownership, which, as you say, there are all kinds of social mechanisms and rules that would recognize that. And again, the man has a subsidiary feeling of obligation, especially if there's a baby involved. That I cannot totally abandon her. I'll go and buy her a house, but I don't have to marry her. I mean, that's such a common thing, in Chinese kinship practices.
That's a great observation, and I think you really point to the really key issue here. Is I think I sort of briefly mentioned that in the conclusion, but I think the point needs to be elaborated in terms of the difference. I think, it just makes me think more about this woman, the difference. I think you're absolutely right. I think in pre-modern China, a lot of time when Ruby Watson talks about marriage as a transferring of things as well as people, women were really, seen as a form of thing and the property, and the rights over them were transferred, and the negotiation was done by king group and the male head of the household. So they did not have much saying, and then the moving into the husband, the patrilineal family. So that was the property ownership of the husband is very crucial for the well-being of this woman. But today, these people, these women are actually active players in this whole game. They are the active players, negotiating, calculating, doing all the stuff. It's not, nobody forces them, their parents. It's not their parents. They are doing all this calculation. And so I think that is a major, a difference there. I think I should, point out.
And then, sorry. You go please. And
Right.
then,
So, it seems like broadly there might be two things going on in terms of types of representation. One which you announce, and one perhaps that's more subtle, and one that we've talked about already, is that there seems to be one story here of historical transformation. So that you lay out a narrative where there's a shift from social moral embeddedness of persons, and as it's eclipsed in the contemporary by an emerging materialistic standards of self-worth. And then there seems to also be this other, perhaps, narrative in your argument, which is exactly the shock of the anthropologist, which is also the shock of ourselves, around the imbrication of love and the intimate with economic preoccupations. So, a few things you said, which is talking about the explicitness at one moment of, advertising your wealth and personal. You said, this was really said as a kind of qualifier, but also index of kind of shock. And another moment when you were interviewing, when you said, you had a bit of discomfort around questioning your friend if she had a new villa, but it didn't seem like she had a marriage contract. So it seems like perhaps there's this other strand, which is exactly this haunting by the norm, that true sentiment or intimacy, or I think what you call romance, should exactly be shed of the social skin of either status or economic preoccupation or even physical appearance. And so then, what makes this paper provocative, which is, on the one hand, is it historical interest, exactly that of transformation, which would be a self-sufficient interest for anybody interested in scholarship, right? That would be an end in itself. But the other one is perhaps, is it provocative because exactly what you document unsettles the distinction that we believe ought to be in place. That is the norm that should separate intimate life from economic preoccupations or other types of social, from the social skin.
But the Chinese
You put it so nicely, so I don't know what to say. Yes, yeah. I don't know. The what will be the question I can answer? I think you eloquently put it that way.
It's that. Either for you, or as you anticipate an audience, or for a moment, for either anthropology, whatever we want to call it, what is provocative about it? Is it the documentation of historical transformation, or is it that we find a norm that we believe ought to be in place, that is the kind of purity of the intimate, seemingly corrupted?
Okay. I think, you know, to be honest, I mean, when I wrote the paper and the book, I think certainly the first narrative was my main purpose. But as I think developed ideas, especially now, you know, giving talks at various places, and when people raise all these questions around the issue, the second possibility of thinking about this whole issue, that you know, I began to kind of think along that line. But I think originally, I think my goal was to kind of document this major shift, and that it is very shocking to me. I mean, as an ethnographer, I mean, I grew up in China, so there is this profound sense of shock, you know, when you go back to do research, especially when you compare with the Maoist era, how different things are today. But you know, for the older generation,
It's still a moral economy. It's just that they change different things. Beautiful bodies, you know, breast implants. I mean, you know what I mean? It's an exchange, and you seem to want to say that, you know, it no longer is governed by moral norms or something. But these are the new moral norms.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think you shouldn't say the market economy is not. It's not more anymore. But the shift you mentioned early in your question, I think it's important here. I want to kind of elaborate a little bit in the paper, is the shift from this really socially embedded sense, how people conceived of the person's self-worth largely in this interpersonal relationship, and that has changed a lot. Today, I mean, yes, people still concerned about their neighbors, friends, and stuff, but getting less and less, especially in the new upscale communities. You talk to the security guards and those people, they would say, you know, these new rich, they don't even look at us. They look at street through as if we don't exist. They don't really care about cultivating relationship with their neighbors, with these gatekeepers. But, you know, under socialism, we would really know, even the old guy who sits at the gate, you want to cultivate a relationship with them. You care deeply about, you know, all the social relationships. I think that has changed because these people now feel like they have all the right to be arrogant, to be nasty, because they own all those nice property and they can shout at the security guards. So it becomes so, I think, externalized in the sense that it becomes like a, you know, your self-worth is so much displaced on the kinds of things you earn rather than in the social relationship.
The woman had to negotiate and calculate through using other people, like getting your mother or your brother to do things you can't do for yourself directly. But now you don't need that. You can do it by improving the way you look or your education. I mean, so now it's entirely through, you know, your own individual self.
Yeah, that part definitely comes out, right? You're cultivating your body, the individual. But then the social embedded relation continues to be important in some realms. So even when divorce takes place, right, people talk so extensively with their family members. It's not like they just take it like, this is my business here. You know, I decide, I inform my parents. Oh no. They consult. They still consult their parents and sisters and brothers. So that's still there. So you still see, I think, the two processes. Sorry, yeah.
No, I want to answer that question.
Kind of follow up this kinship and family discussion a little bit. Because actually in China, it's also related to the Chinese part of this story, this narratives. Because actually in China, I mean, a young couple getting married, it's never about the two persons themselves, right? It's always, I mean, the family is always involved. In all the stories about property and housing, actually for younger urban middle class couples, a lot of time the parents, they are paying the down payments for them, and then they'll pay the mortgages by themselves. I mean, that's actually the typical case for young generations in urban China, right?
You're talking like people in their 20s-ish?
Early 30s, right? Especially if you want to talk about the emergence of the middle class, if we don't really want to only focus on, upper scale, really very, very rich people, but the majority of, middle class, actually the family, parents still, and sometimes parents of the two both sides, they're still playing a very, very important role. And also say in rural areas, I see really parents living in very, very terrible, shabby shack, but putting all their family savings to build a new house for their son. Because you really have to spend years and years of efforts and savings to build this house for your son. Otherwise, he is not going to get married. So this is a kind of continuity about this kinship thing. I mean, I was just mentioned. And so I'm wondering, of course, I mean, romance is a very, very important and also interesting topic in your writing. But I mean, where are the other family members in your stories? Their parents, I mean, their families, their brothers and sisters. Of course, I mean, under the one-child policy, it'll be something different. But really, I mean, it's just probably from my own observations. I mean, actually, family members are still, very, very important. And this not true in the United States or other, parts of the world. I mean, not much, not that much, because actually for young couples, actually they're not really able to really afford to buy a house by themselves. So parents are still, their income and the contribution still matters a lot.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right, especially for the younger generation. A lot of people I worked with in the study, most of them are in their 40s or their late 30s. So a lot of them actually were able to purchase that, but I know what you're saying for especially the younger ones. I mean, in the 20s and the early 30s, a lot of them do need the help of their parents, and parents still play a very important role in financing the home, even though the house is seen as the son's house, but it's actually the family has to pull the resources together. And then for the even younger ones now, precisely because of the single child, parents are willing to put in anything they have for their children, for their son especially, in order for them to get married. So that I think, that is still very, very important there. Yeah. But it doesn't come through too much, I think, in this discussion here. Only in the sort of the inadequacy part, you can see a little bit like kind of the shadow of the parents talking. I mean, they really look down upon their son-in-law because he has no right to speak. 腰杆不直. You can't raise your back in the household because you don't provide. So, yeah.
Just had a further question about the notion of shock, or the shock of a kind of historic a change in property regimes and self-value that you feel as an ethnographer, but that's also experienced by some of the people that you're studying, or that emerges in, say, some of the newspaper articles that you began the talk with, right? Where you have people actually complaining about this kind of terrible transformation from a society in which people are valued for what they are or their contributions to society, and suddenly they're divested of that value because of the new rights regime or property rights regime, right? So this gets to the question, I guess, of alternative voices or resistance to the implementation or the this juggernaut of housing changing China, right? Are there voices that speak against this, or are there kind of residual sets of values that are left over from the socialist era that are still kind of active or significant in the present moment, right?
So just to get that right, but I thought if it is the residual from the socialist era, then precisely they will probably those are the people who would be actually very shocked, because you are your reference point is, if you grew up under socialism like me and maybe Liu Xing and some other people, of course you are shocked, right? You can't believe it because you thought that was the how life should be, and now you have this. And for people who grew up in the West, and they would say, oh yeah, it's very similar to what's happening here. And the older generation will say, well, yeah, before 解放前, it was like this too, we calculated. But for this generation, a lot of people I studied, the 40s and the 50s and the late 30s, that's what they thought life was going to be or ought to be. And now you look at what's happening. I think it's interesting. I mean, people both embrace that. They feel it. Yes, I want to have my private property ownership, but I want this. I want to embrace that. On the other hand, they are very shocked if, given what they lived through under socialism. Alternative voices would be, in this case, what do you mean? People who are not shocked or critical, who would, is that what you sort of?
No, for instance, I think in your previous work and the kind of media accounts we hear about contemporary China, often people who are say protesting being relocated or protesting various community issues actually use the discourse of property rights as a means actually to protest abuses, right?
Yes.
Or as a banner under which they organize in grassroots fashion, right? But I'm wondering if the alternative is true. That is, if there's still a set of values left over from socialism that say, housing is still a right that should be conferred upon us by the state, or my worth as an individual does not collapse down to what I own, but in fact is, an index of something else, right? Are there operative values outside of market values that you see coming into play in the discourse?
Okay, I think that's where the question of 素质 comes into play, is because people also, in addition to material possession, they also talk about 素质 when you choose supposing 素质好, 素质不好. And that's very tricky because 素质 is not just about material possession, right? It's largely also about education and your cultural background and even your family standing. People still talk about whether you come from a good family, meaning, for example, nowadays intellectual families or versus working class families. So that also gets put into this vague package of 素质. So people sometimes do draw upon that notion to show that I'm not completely materialistic or vulgar. I also care about the 素质. But I think when it comes to, if you have to find a man with good 素质but completely no ownership of, probably people are nowadays, most of them are very reluctant. So it's not that they don't care about other stuff now, but I think it's a hierarchy, what they see as the most important. Ideally would be finding a man with a house and a nice car and high 素质, high education, right? But oftentimes it doesn't work that way in reality. So you have to kind of negotiate, and not everyone would choose according to this hierarchy either. And in other contexts, I think the residual voices definitely come out much more clearly in your case about relocation study. And I also did study on people's protest on sort of the master new urban planning of Kunming, and you do see the alternative voices. Yeah, thank you.
So.
我为了刘老师问最后一个问题。
Why do you wait this long until this moment when the clock strikes? Okay, so one last question.
Maybe later.
No. We insist.
In the same kind of direction, I wanted you to clarify. Everybody is using the term middle class. We sort of tend to think middle class is actually a convenient hat for some people to choose to wear. When we use these kind of categories, are we using it simply as a descriptive term, or are we using it as a theoretical notion? So it seems to be really slippery here in the definition of the term, and we just take it for granted. That's why there's this question: what do we expect? If not shocked. I think everywhere would be shocking to the bourgeois, middle class consciousness. So in that sense, what exactly we are trying to discover in this new so-called new historical transition.
Yeah, yeah, that's a big question, and actually that's the sort of organizing theme of the book. The introduction I wrote is thinking about what's, if not new, but what's unique about the Chinese middle class, if we can call that, the features that defines that. And I think actually in the book, I prefer to use just straight actually 中产阶层, and I talk about why that's the case. Because when you say middle class, immediately you have this whole baggage of what we understand as a middle class. Why what middle class refers to in China is actually very, very different from what we understand here as middle class. You know, 中产阶层 in China is actually, first of all, descriptively refers to a much higher upper scale class, not what we understand here has this huge middle class. It's actually a relatively very small section of the population. So probably what people think here as a upper middle class. And also there, I think what's very different in the book I talks about is this double movement again. Double movement in that you see in China what we call the 中产阶层 are caught in this very interesting dilemma. So on the one hand, they want to retreat back to the wall, their private paradise, and they want to seek privacy, seclusion, and all the stuff, and not have anything to do with the new poor. The emerging new poor, by setting up walls and security guards and cameras. So that's one movement. On the other hand, I think the book shows other chapters is that these people are constantly pushed out into the public space to engage public activism when they feel their rights are infringed upon by the developers, by Wuguan, the property management agencies. So there is this constant, I mean, this is one of the probably the largest urban activism movement in China today is actually middle class. Either they are being displaced or they have all sorts of conflicts with the management. So I think this double movement there is a very distinct feature of what defines the Chinese middle class movement today. But there is tons of debates and discussion whether we should call it middle class or not, and then what would be an appropriate way of calling that. Yeah, I won't get into that, but thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for
So where's the
And thank you everyone for coming today.